All right, welcome to the first of several, hopefully several preseason videos going over week 0 and week 1 plays that I made or might make as we head into the season. These are supposed to be pretty short, hopefully, 8 to 10 minutes, not getting too deep in the weeds on the subjective analysis stuff, but more just about the process of capping early season college football, what to look for, what adjustments to make. It's a unique part of the season. It needs to be approached very differently than, for example, week 8 or week 10 or conference championships. This is a different animal. It's one that I've traditionally had success with, and the lines, this is no secret, the lines early in the season are much softer, the market is weaker, and it's by far the best time to capitalize. But there's a lot of guesswork, and in some cases it'll feel like throwing darts because we just don't know. But of course, the people who set the lines don't really know either. I wanted to hit on 3 games. I've played 6 so far between week 0 and week 1, but I wanted to focus on 3 for this video and then probably do 3 next week and then see where the market goes from here in terms of what else I add in the interim. But start with just the basics of how I approach this. This is certainly, I'm no genius. This is not exactly a revelatory thing here, but I take as my starting point, my baseline power ratings, as I say, let's pretend these 2 teams met at the end of last year in a hypothetical bowl game. What would that line have been had that meeting occurred in, mid-December, late December, instead of, week 0? And I look at that and say, okay, well, that's my baseline. And I use, of course, there's a million different metric sites out there, but I use FPI. I find that most closely tracks Vegas, offshore, whatever the lines are out there. So that's my starting point, is to take the FPI number. And FPI is out for this year as well, so we can pretty easily compare side by side and say, what would this line have been using FPI last year, and what is it now at the start of the 2023 season? So that's my baseline. I use a couple other things. I use Colin Wilson's TARP. I think he does a nice job with that for, incorporating transfer stuff and returning production. I think returning production for a while was looking very overvalued. And now with some of the ways that guys like Colin are finding ways to adjust for transfer activity, it's a more useful tool. I started to hate on it last year. I think it had just become a little bit too baked into the numbers, into the narratives. But this year, it looks like they found a way to adjust that, which is great. I also look at a couple other metrics, and I use, I'm pretty big on coaching changes, not necessarily the head coach, which everybody knows, but some of the more subtle coordinator stuff that could have a pretty big impact, especially guys who are coming from the FCS level where there's less known publicly about their approach and their style. Look at Minnesota and Nebraska. This line, I think, opened around 7. I played it there a couple weeks ago at 7. Sat for like the last week or 2 at 7.5, 8, but I think it's come back down to 7 across the market. I wouldn't expect much movement. Pretty good number overall. I mean, maybe as we get closer, you see some money on either side, but it's with more money coming into the market, the fact that it's still not moving a whole lot tells me this one's not going to take off in either direction, barring some sort of major injury. But in essence, look at these 2 teams. Where would this line have been had they met at the very end of last season? Well, we're using the final FPI rankings. There's about a 12-point gap here on a neutral field. But if we give Minnesota 3, maybe 3.5 for home field, you're talking about a 15.5 point line at the end of last season. Well, now it's sitting 7. So you have an 8.5 point swing. And I'm not really sure why the gap is that wide, because this is more getting into the subjective stuff that I'm trying to avoid getting into the weeds on. But is this a Tanner Morgan thing? Is this a Mo Ibrahim thing? I mean, really, what is Nebraska that improved? FPI tells you that they're, 3.8 points better this year. Maybe, but that also feels more like a ceiling projection than a median projection. Like the floor here is still really low. I mean, Matt Rule, good coach. I like the hire, but to say Nebraska's almost 4 points better, effective week 1, that feels like a stretch. That feels like getting close to that like 80th, 90th percentile outcome rather than a 50th percentile outcome. So I think Nebraska's overadjusted, and I think Minnesota is getting dinged a little bit too much. This is a really good developmental program. So it's when you look at them and you say, well, they've lost a ton on defense. Sure. But with developmental programs, oftentimes you don't know about these guys who are lower on the depth chart who are then ascending into starting roles. You don't hear them. You're not familiar with them. I'm not familiar with them because they're often under recruited, and Minnesota knows how to recruit to the scheme. Joe Rossi is a great defensive coordinator. He's been there quite a while. He and his guys know what they're looking for. I trust him to have identified these guys and to have coached them up enough. So yeah, they lost a lot on paper, but if you're baking in like a big drop off in Minnesota defense, I just can't see that. Offensively, they lose a really talented back and they lose a productive quarterback who was there for 30 years. But, is the drop off from Morgan to Ethan, the Greek rifle, that significant? I mean, I don't know. Some people will tell you it is. I'm no expert, but it seems to me like this is all very over-adjusted. I think to swing this line 8 points with all the unknowns seems aggressive. If you told me the line was 3 to 4 off of last year's number, I'd say, okay, that's reasonable. But 8 is a lot. So I was pretty comfortable with Minnesota at 7. I would not go above a TV. This is a team that plays painfully slow. They were either the slowest or the second lowest tempo team last year. Second slowest team in seconds per play. And a team that threw the ball less often than anyone other than the service academies. That's going to change this year without Ibrahim and with a more aggressive quarterback. I think that's going to look more like 55-45, maybe 60-40 instead of, 67-33. But anyway, that's my basis for Minnesota, Nebraska. Just the numbers play. Like, it just is so far removed from where we were last year, and I just don't see it for either side being that extreme. Shifting gears to what I just had up here. I hit a total, 9 days ago. Virginia Tech ODU over 48, rematch from last year. Oddly enough, that total last year was around the same number. I think it closed 48-ish, 48 and a half. You don't need me to tell you, 2 shitty offenses last year. I mean, really bad. But silver lining for the over here is both were fast. ODU was really fast. They threw a ton. Virginia Tech above average. They were around the top 50 in tempo. But the bigger news for Old Dominion is they brought in Kevin Decker from Fordham, architect of one of the premier offenses in the FCS. Last year, Fordham was 9th in plays per minute. They were 3rd in yards per pass, threw the ball 54% of the time. This was a dynamite offense. And some of these metrics for Old Dominion, they fired their offensive coordinator midseason. They brought in an interim who was an offensive line coach before. I mean, this was a mess. They did hit some explosive plays, surprisingly, but with Decker now calling the plays, he's going to keep the really fast tempo, but it's an exponentially better scheme while keeping that tempo and maybe even slightly faster. And, this is a really big jump for ODU. Clearly, Ricky Ronnie wants to play fast. He comes from the Penn State tree, as does Brent Pry. And Pry, known as a defensive guy, but they played with some tempo too. And we'll see what happens with the quarterback situation if Kyron Drones from Baylor beats out Wells. He certainly looks like the much more talented option, would give the offense more upside. But this game at 48, you're talking about, I think it plays much faster than that total would lead you to believe. It's going to be wildly inefficient, probably a lot of 3 and outs. But, if these teams are running up 75 plays per side, even with some red zone inefficiency, I think it gets there. It just looks like a much faster game than you might be led to believe based on track records of these teams. And I think you're seeing the market kind of looking at Old Dominion saying, well, you don't have a quarterback. Hayden Wolf, who was, no stud to begin with, he transfers a month ago. You got a bunch of guys who no one's ever heard of. But, one of them comes from Fordham. I don't know if he's the front runner or not, but he's been in this really great scheme for a couple of years. So this is one where you have to kind of close your eyes and have some faith in the system and the scheme that Decker has, because if you say, well, I need it to be based on what I'm looking at right now, then you're not going to pull the trigger on an over here. But I do think this one, maybe as it gets closer, people start to take another look at Decker. I think this one may be close. It's more like 50-51, and 51 is one of the most important, 3 or 4 most important totals in college football. So I really wanted a number below that to get it to 48. I thought was pretty good, but we'll see where this goes. Third and final game for this video, take a look at North Texas and Cal. This is a list of where the lines would have been last year and where they are this year. I mentioned, we already talked about Nebraska, Minnesota, 8.5 point differential based on the current circle line. Cal North Texas is even more extreme. I'm not going to talk about Colorado and TCU because that is obviously quite a unique circumstance. But with Cal North Texas, I'm not sure why. And these types of things, again, it's early in the season and no one is sure about anything. And if they say they are, they're full of shit. But the market seems very low on Eric Morris, considering how much he's accomplished in his really short career. A dynamite play caller. I mean, he's one of probably the guy who built Incarnate Word into this FCS offensive juggernaut. Goes to Wazoo for a year, put up really good numbers there with, an FCS transfer quarterback. And I'm not sure if the market is upset about Seth Luttrell being fired. He's an okay coach. They did an okay job there. But this is pricing in like a huge North Texas drop-off. And they had some transfers in the spring for sure. But I think there's more talent here than the market is giving credit for. In Cal, I watched Sam Howard, just like all these other, college football junkies, and said, yeah, this kid's got some potential, but it's all hypothetical for now. And to make Cal a double-digit favorite here, a Northern California team going into the North Texas heat in late August, early September, and all that humidity, I think it's a weird spot for Cal. Justin Wilcox laying double digits is really bad. And you can double check the numbers. I could post it on Twitter at some point, but it's really bad. I think 6 of the last 7 he's failed to cover, and some of them have been like miserable non-covers where they're just like either eking out victories or they're losing outright. He's just not built. He's not that kind of coach built to lay double digits, especially on the road. I don't know exactly where the market's pricing North Texas right now, but it's, I don't know, like 110. Looks like 105, 110, somewhere in that range. If we assume Cal is around 55-ish. So this one, to swing that game 11.5 points, Cal's got a decent amount coming back. Maybe that's playing a role here. But this is another one that to me just looks wildly over-adjusted, considering North Texas probably would have been a really small favorite had they played at the end of last year. North Texas offense has a good TARP rating because they brought in Chandler Rogers, who was the guy at UL Monroe, like an average quarterback and a pretty good Sun Belt. I mean, he could have done a lot worse as far as bringing in a transfer quarterback. So I don't mind Rogers by any means. Both defenses took a big hit. I'm sorry. Both defenses were pretty lousy last year. Cal bringing in Spavital is an interesting move. A lot of success as an offensive coordinator. Didn't do well as a head coach. I'm just not sure. This is kind of like Nebraska, where right now I think you're looking at the market pricing it as close to a ceiling outcome. Like this to me is like an 80th percentile, 90th percentile outcome for Cal, and like a floor outcome for North Texas. And we have no idea what North Texas is. I mean, we have really no clue. But if you're telling me that the current price is the floor, then I'm probably going to buy it. It just is way too low. So that's one I also expect. Cal's taken some money early. I wonder if the move has already happened. You start seeing some North Texas buyback as the season gets closer. Either way, I was content. Anything above 7, so to get 10, I was happy with. If it goes the other way, hey, it is what it is. But I did like that number. Hopefully next week or the week after, cover the other 3 that I've played. Anything that I add in the meantime. It's weird right now because, I'm basically only playing them as they get to my number. So I can go 2-3 weeks without playing anything. But obviously, as we get closer, limits go up. More of the big money gets involved. We should start to see more movement, probably early mid-August. Plus, we have suspension season, where these guys go out and do dumb shit and get themselves suspended for different reasons. So that could shake up the market as well. But until next time, thank you for tuning in. I'll see you for the next one.